All right, folks, you are behind the scenes with me and our guest, Paul Smith. We are about to go live in front of our Zoom audience, so bear with us. All right, here we go, Paul. Hello, everyone. This is Eric Glazer, and welcome to a special episode of Bright Spots in Healthcare, produced by Shared Purpose Connect. I started this show on a cold morning in February 2014, and my very first event was a disaster. I was actually kicked off the call 15 minutes into it, and I wasn't able to get back onto the platform until about 10 minutes before the show's completion. However, my 17 participants did tell me I was onto something, so I kept on with it. And today is our 10-year anniversary episode. Now, the show has evolved a lot over the decade and is now one of the leading B2B healthcare podcasts. And people sometimes ask me how I've been able to grow the show and recruit such great guests and sponsors. Well, it's because in the early years, I had wonderful support from friends and colleagues. And then I was able to build a small but tremendous team that today runs the company. But I had one pinnacle moment that changed our trajectory. And it was when I read a book called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath back in 2015. In that book, the authors share a story about a man by the name of Jerry Sternin, who represented an organization called Save the Children. And in the mid-90s, Jerry was asked to travel to Vietnam to solve the epidemic of malnourished children in their country. He was told by authorities that solving the epidemic was tied to poverty, lack of clean water, poor sanitation structure, and an inferior education system. But Jerry chose to ignore the so-called experts, and instead he went into the villages and he started meeting families. And he soon identified families whose children were not underweight or unhealthy. And he started studying these families' behaviors. And he did this at the cost of not focusing on the majority of families whose children were indeed undernourished. And he noticed similarities in how mothers of these deviant families were feeding their children, doing things that were deemed unsatisfying or inappropriate for children within their culture at this time. Things like mixing crawfish and greens into the rice for protein and vitamins, and feeding their children smaller portions, but 3 or 4 times a day versus the traditional larger portion once a day. And so Jerry created a way for these new approaches to scale by organizing local cooking socials where mothers would teach other mothers how to cook and prepare these dishes. And once mothers learned how to cook differently, they would host their own similar social gatherings. And this train the trainer approach went viral. And in a mere 2 years, Jerry had reduced malnutrition in the villages of Vietnam by 20%. Without the help of the internet, mobile phones, or social media. 10 years later, Emory University conducted research on malnourished children in Vietnam and found that the nationwide level of nutrition that Jerry had established a decade earlier had sustained itself. Children who were not even born during Jerry's visit were being fed the dishes that Jerry helped go viral. So here is why this story was a pinnacle moment for me and the show. When we analyze big, complicated problems like malnutrition in Vietnam or healthcare in America, we seek a solution that befits the scale of the problem. So naturally, the experts on malnutrition in Vietnam wanted to talk about poverty and education and sanitation systems. But what Jerry did was not focus on the massive problem of poverty and poor education, but on the positive deviance or bright spots. And then he determined a way to scale those small successes. So the message here is important for all of you. A problem may look hopelessly complex in healthcare, but rather than initially looking for a massive long-term solution, use the strategy of looking for things that are already working well among the chaos. And these bright spots will often generate progress and maybe an entire solution strategy to your toughest issues. Back in February of 2014, our first session was listened to by 17 people. I was kicked off the platform and the recording did not work. And now, in February 2023, Bright Spots in Healthcare episodes have already been downloaded this month alone close to 2,000 times, and we are supported annually by dozens of corporate sponsors. So whether it be increasing star ratings or improving care access or the endless other big problems facing our industry, our mission on this show is to identify bright spots and bring them right here to you. And maybe some of you will then clone them at your organization. So today, in celebration of our 10-year anniversary, the title of this episode is Sell with a Story in Healthcare. And unlike most episodes that are payer and provider centric, today we're going to focus on all those organizations that offer incredible services and technologies to payers and providers, and then partner with them to create new story-worthy bright spots. And our guest today is simply a home run. 10-year anniversary gift to all of you. You are welcome. I was doing my own research, started reading a book called Sell with a Story. And halfway through, I said, I got to get this guy on the podcast. So today's guest is Paul Smith. He is one of the world's leading experts on business storytelling. He spent 2 years as a consultant at Accenture and then 2 decades at Procter & Gamble. He is one of Inc. magazine's 100 top leadership speakers. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, Time, Forbes, and Success Magazine, among others. And he is a best-selling author. His books include, write these down, Lead with a Story, which reached #1 bestseller in Amazon's business communication category. He also wrote The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, also reached #1 in Amazon's business communication category. The aforementioned Sell with a Story reached #1 in Amazon's selling category and is in its 4th printing. He also authored Parenting with a Story, and his newest book is a biography of a deaf storyteller called 4 Days with Kenny Tedford. He lives in Mason, Ohio, with his wife and 2 sons, and now he can add to his accolades guest on the 10-year anniversary episode of Bright Spots in Healthcare. So welcome, Paul, to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'll definitely have to add that to my bio.
I love it. I wanted to start off. And folks, you'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A module. We should have time to integrate questions. This is how we planned it. I want to start off with, why does good storytelling work in rapport building and selling? And maybe provide us an example right off the bat here of a good story.
Yeah, well, so I'll answer the question first, and then I'll give you an example. So there are probably dozens of reasons, but I'll give you my top 2 reasons why storytelling works so well. And the main one is that human beings don't make decisions the way we'd like to think we do. In fact, you probably read about this in that book Switch as well. It turns out, instead of making the logical, rational decisions that we'd like to think we do, it turns out most of us, most of the time, make subconscious, emotional, sometimes irrational decisions in one place in our brain. And then we justify those decisions logically and rationally in a different place in our brain. And so a more conscious, logical processing part of the brain. So we leave a decision making process only aware of the logical part of it, but unaware of the real driving force is the emotional subconscious part of it. And stories are just uniquely well qualified to help you reach that other subconscious emotional processing part of the brain. And if you want to be effective at convincing people of things, whether that's leadership or sales or marketing, you need to speak to both parts of the brain, and stories are just uniquely well qualified to help you do that. You know, the second out of the probably dozen reasons that I would tell you is that it helps build trust. And in fact, there was a study done, it's probably been a couple of decades now, in the New York Times, and they asked a really interesting question. They asked, what % of people in the world are trustworthy? And the answers were really disappointing. It was like 30%. The average person thought about 1/3 of the world's population was trustworthy. But then they asked the question a slightly different way. They said, what % of people that you know personally are trustworthy? And the answer shot up to like 80 or 90%. And the reason for that is that human beings naturally trust people that we know until you give them a reason not to. But we naturally distrust people we don't know. And it turns out, it can take months to earn your way into that circle of trust, or you can kind of skip to the front of the line by just sharing a few personal stories. Because once somebody knows you personally, you're immediately in that, well, now I trust you until you prove me that I shouldn't, right? So reading them your resume won't do that, but a few personal stories will do that. So it brings you into the circle of trust much faster than having to earn it the old-fashioned way. So those are the two of the most important reasons why storytelling works. An example, though, I'll give you is a bit of a fanciful one. It's one that actually happened to me and my wife a few summers ago. We were at an art fair here in Cincinnati, and we were looking for a piece of art for our son's bathroom here at home. Or I should say my wife was looking for a picture for their bathroom, and I was along for the ride. And so we were going booth to booth to booth, and we got to this booth of this one guy, this underwater photographer, a guy named Chris Guglielmello. Look this guy up. He takes amazing, mesmerizing pictures of underwater sea life, sea anemones and coral reefs and sharks and whales and whatnot. Well, anyway, she's flipping through his pictures, and she just gets emotionally attached to this one picture that, to me, looked about as out of place as a pig in the ocean. And the reason, Eric, was because it was a picture of a pig in the ocean, right? Which is just, it was ridiculous, right? That makes no sense at all. Pigs are not seafaring creatures. They typically don't swim. You don't find them in the ocean. So when I got my chance to ask the question and the artist was there, I said, dude, what's with the pig in the ocean? And that's when the magic started. The guy said, oh, yeah, Paul, that was crazy. He said, that picture was taken off the coast of this uninhabited island in the Bahamas called Big Major Cay. And he said, apparently what happened was a few years earlier, some local entrepreneur decided to raise a pig farm for bacon, I guess. And he found out there was this uninhabited island nearby where he could keep the pigs for free, because nobody owned it, nobody lived on it, whatever. And he's no dummy. So of course he's going to keep them in the free place, right? Well, he said, but if you look at the picture, he said, look up behind the pig up on the beach. What kind of vegetation do you see growing up there beyond the beach? And I kind of squinted and looked at it and I said, those look like cactus. And he said, yeah, they are. He said, that's a problem. It turns out pigs don't like cactus, right? I mean, like to eat, like who would want to eat cactus, right? I mean, it's all prickly. He said, so it turns out really there was just not much for them to eat on the island. So the entrepreneur wasn't that smart after all, because literally the pigs had nothing to eat. Well, fortunately for the entrepreneur and the pigs, I guess, a local restaurant owner on a neighboring island was boating his kitchen refuse every night over to Big Major Cay, a few dozen yards offshore, and dumping the kitchen refuse overboard, like literally getting rid of his kitchen scraps. Well, if you're a hungry pig, you typically don't swim, but if you get hungry enough, you'll do anything, right? So eventually one of these little pigs dog paddled or pig paddled his way out to get this food that's floating out there. And, first it's one little pig, and then it's two little piggies, and then three little piggies. And here it is, several generations later, and all the pigs on Big Major Cay can swim. And apparently that is the reason why. And he said, so when I got there, normally I have to put on all my scuba equipment and go underwater and wait for hours for something interesting to happen. He said, but when I got to Big Major Cay, the pigs started swimming up to my boat, right? They thought I was the guy from the restaurant. They thought they were going to get fed. So all I did is I leaned over the side of my boat with my camera, snapped a picture, one of the easiest pictures I've ever taken. And it's one of my best sellers. And at that moment I was like, okay, sold for cash right now. We'll take it. Now, ask yourself why, because 2 minutes earlier, that was just a stupid, inexplicable picture of a pig in the ocean that I had no interest in buying. But 2 minutes later, after hearing that story, I had to have it. And I had to have it, Eric, because I love the story, right? I love listening to the story. I love telling the story. If you come to my house and go to the bathroom, you're going to hear me tell the story again, because it's the one that's up there, right? And, it's an animal psychology lesson, a history lesson, and a geography lesson all kind of rolled into one. And now ask yourself, how could he have sold me that picture in a more traditional way? Features and benefits. And he might have said something like this. He might have said, well, look, Paul, there are 3 reasons why you should buy this particular picture. First of all, it's the right size to fit on the bathroom wall where your wife wants it to go. She's shown me a picture of the bathroom already. Secondly, it's the right color palette to fit with the decor in your bathroom. And thirdly, it's in the price range that you've already said you're willing to spend on this picture. So that's why you should buy this picture. And those would have been 3 very rational, logical reasons to buy that picture. but there were probably dozens of other pictures at that art fair that met all three of those three criteria. But there's only one that had an interesting story attached to it. And that's why that's the one that's hanging upstairs in my kid's bathroom. So it was the story turned something very ordinary and odd, really, and that I had nothing of interest, no interest in, into something valuable that I had to have. And I know that's just a silly story of a pig, but that's what made me buy that picture. And so that's just an example of the power of storytelling when you're trying to sell something or market something or convince somebody of the value of something.
Yeah, that is super compelling. I actually enjoyed hearing it live. I know you tell the story in the book too, but that was actually really incredible. Let's start breaking down like what stories, because you talk about a whole vast portfolio of tactics and strategies that organizations should be thinking about when it comes to selling with a story. And so what stories do you think companies need to be able to tell? And I guess I'm gonna pick some of my favorite categories and just have you react to them. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think folks should be really getting ready to take some good notes here. But let's start with making the main pitch. Like, talk to me about a story and the approach to storytelling around making the main pitch.
Yeah. So first of all, recognize that's obviously not going to be the first story you're going to tell. The whole, if you look at the whole sales process, there's, the moment you meet a prospect and building rapport, then you make the sales pitch, then you resolve objections, then you close the sale, then you even service after the sale. And there are stories that fit in all those parts of the sales process. The one you're asking about is kind of in the middle. And probably the most obvious one that people tell at that point is, a customer.
Actually, Paul, let's back up then. Let's 86 my question, or at least pause it for a second. Let's talk about what's the one or two stories that the folks should start with.
So you're in that first phase is you've just met somebody that might be a prospect, right? And you need to convince them to let you spend, 30 minutes or an hour with them making your sales pitch someday. But you don't get to make the sales pitch the moment you meet somebody unless you're a Girl Scout selling cookies at the front door, right? And most of us are not that. So, so you're going to tell a short story about what it is that you do that is helpful to people, so that they get a general idea of, am I interested in hearing more from this person? So it's not a whole sales pitch. It's just one very short story about what it is that you do that might entice them to want to spend more time with you, right? The second group are building rapport. That's where you're telling stories about yourself so that you earn their trust. That's what we talked about earlier, why building trust, stories can help you do that. Those are just little personal stories. So now they trust you. They might even like you a little bit. And now you're ready to make a sales pitch to them. But before those two things, before they know what it is that you even do, and do I even know and like who you are? I can't remember who it is that said we don't really care what somebody does until we know why they do it. Those are the kind of stories you're telling before you ever get to that sales pitch. Right.
And before I want to jump around here a little bit, Paul, but as folks are thinking, okay, I need a rapport story. I think I have one. I have one that helps build trust with a new prospect. How long should a story be? Just so as people think about modifying their approach, or are they doing the right thing?
So these that I'll share an example with next is in the making the sales pitch. They're probably a couple of minutes, 1, 2, 3 minutes long. Some of the earlier ones might be 30 or 45 seconds. I mean, you can have really short ones, but these are not 7, 8, 9, 10-minute sagas. These are short stories that will punctuate the conversations that you're having with people. So the story is not the sales pitch. The stories are just things that you tell along the way during the conversation. So they're very short. A couple of minutes, is pretty average. So back to your question. In that sales pitch, the most obvious type of story that you would tell is a customer success story. And I don't need to tell you one of those because everybody has those. You're telling a story about some other company or person who's bought your product or service and loved it, right? And every salesperson has several examples of those, and those are the most important ones to tell. One of the ones that people don't know they need to tell in this point, and it's the one I'd probably give you an example of here, is what I call a problem story. So this is a story about the quintessential problem that your product or service solves. And so these stories do not have a happy ending. right? Your customer success stories have a happy ending. Somebody comes in with a problem and we fixed it. The problem stories are somebody has a problem, they didn't come in, and so we didn't fix it, right? It's just they have a problem and they still have the problem, and that sucks for them. And these stories are important because they're especially important if your prospect doesn't even know they have the problem that they have. So my favorite example of this one comes from a guy named Kevin Moulton, and his company sells what he describes as internet security protocol systems, which is a mouthful for they're the ones that do the programming so that when you buy something online or get money out of an ATM, nobody steals your credit card information. So this the security systems, right? And when he has a sales call on a bank to sell them these internet security protocol systems, he always has a sales pitch, but he always tells them a story about what happened to him a few summers ago in Las Vegas. He's at a sales conference, and you know what it's like in Vegas. You go to the conference during the day, then you go have cheap dinner, and then you go to the casinos, right? You're in Vegas. So he said, I'm at the casino and I'm losing some, and then I'm winning some, and then I'm losing some, and then I'm losing more. And eventually he gets tapped out of cash. So he goes to the machine, puts his card in. It says transaction denied. And he tries another machine, same thing. He just can't get his money out. And he said, I know what's going on, right? He said, I live in New Jersey. All of a sudden, I'm 2,000 miles away in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's the middle of the night, and I'm trying to get a ridiculous amount of money out of this machine. Okay. My bank thinks somebody stole my credit card. And he said, that's fine. I like it that they're looking out for me. But he said he did have a problem with what they did about it. He said they called my wife like on the phone at 4:00 in the morning, New Jersey time. And he said, can you imagine what that part of the phone conversation sounded like? Well, I'm sorry to wake you up at 4 a.m., Mrs. Moulton, but your husband's in a casino at Vegas trying to get a ridiculous amount of money out of this machine. Do you approve of this transaction? And he said, she was mad at me and I was mad at them. And he said, they did not remain my credit card company for very long. I got a new card. And he said, now he could instead in that sales call, Eric, tell them, well, our research shows that 32.5% of your customers are slightly to moderately dissatisfied with their interaction with your banking units. Okay. Now, if he's got that statistic, he should definitely use it. But hopefully you recognize that the story does a much better job than the statistic of helping somebody see what being slightly to moderately dissatisfied might actually look like in practice. It caused a problem in his marriage, for goodness sake, right? Like, isn't that the first rule is do no harm? Like, don't get in the way of your customer's life. So, that is a story that really illustrates the problem that his solution fixes. And after he tells that story, the banker is thinking, oh, geez, I wonder if that happens to our customers. It probably does. I just don't know about it. Yeah, I need to talk to this guy more. Right. So that's an example of a problem story. It's no happy ending. It's not resolved, but it makes them recognize that they probably have a problem that he can then tell them about a solution for.
That's great. Are there, when you mentioned the customer success stories, and those are the most common ones and ones that I think we all have told throughout our years in industry, are there components to the customer success stories that you think aren't always done as well as they need to be, that you could talk a little bit about, like what we should be thinking to refine and enhance our current customer success stories?
Yeah. And so, and you may want to get to this later, but the telling them all using a similar structure and emotionally engaging techniques and techniques to create a surprise. So the nuts and bolts of how you put together a story in a compelling way is the same, whether it's a story you're telling to build rapport or make the same sales pitch or resolve objections. So the structure and the techniques are the same. Those are often not done well. So whenever you want to get to that, I can answer those questions, but they'll apply to all of these stories. But generally, when people are telling these customer success stories, they've got the topic right. Like they've chosen an example of a customer of theirs who had a problem and they solved it in spades, right? They always pick a good example. They don't always tell the story well because they don't get those other components right. But they've at least chosen the right thing to tell a story about, which is not always the case. When people are telling other types of stories, they often don't pick the right topic. But a customer success story, nobody ever chooses a failure to tell that story about. They always choose a success.
So yeah, I do want to get into story structure, but you're right. Let's put a pin on that for a moment and talk a lot about some other stories. So under sort of we've got customer success stories and problem stories, which are important in as we think about I'll say making the pitch. Any other types of stories that we should have in our toolbox ready to go around
well, there are a few others in that group, but we're probably not going to have time to go through them all. It might behoove us to move to the next bucket, which I think is closing the sale.
Let's get into closing. Sure, that's a great idea.
Yeah. So and there are 2 or 3 different types of stories in there. The most important one is called I call creating a sense of urgency. Right. And this story is important when you as a salesperson have already done your job of making the sales pitch and you've done it really well. Okay. And your prospect tells you something like this. Oh, that's fabulous. We need that. We can afford it. It's in the budget. We're definitely going to buy what you're selling, but not now. It's just not a good time. Come back in 6 months. And that's like the bane of all salespeople is I've done everything perfectly and you're still sending me away. Like you want what I'm selling and you are still sending me away. What you need to do at that moment is create a sense of urgency to buy now instead of later. And the simple technique for that, storytelling technique for that, is you're just telling a story about somebody else who had the same objection. This is great, but come back later, and then regretted that decision. So the example I give in the book is about a woman who sells accounts payable software as a service. And she made her whole sales pitch and the prospect said, yeah, we're going to buy that, but come back later, come back in 6 months. We're too busy. Well, in that 6 month period of time, that company acquired one of their biggest competitors. And of course, you don't need 2 accounts payable departments, right? You only need 1. So the acquiring company's accounts payable department, they all got fired. And so now the prospect she was calling on, her department now has double the workload overnight. And if they had purchased her brand new fancy accounts payable software, which is much easier to use, that wouldn't have been a big problem. But because they were still using their old antiquated systems, bringing on double the number of vendors to pay and double the number of bills to pay was just a nightmare. And so now not only could they not keep up with paying the bills, but they certainly didn't have time now to onboard some new and everybody learn some new software package. So now you're going to have to come back a year from now. And she was like, they told me they desperately wish they had bought what I was selling when I sold it to them the first time. And none of this would have been a problem. And you tell a story like that and people realize, oh, there is a cost to waiting because who knows what's going to happen. And I may need this more in the future than I do now. And then it's going to be too late. So stories like that of somebody who had the same objection and then regretted making that decision is the kind of story you want to tell at this point.
All right, love that. So we're taking sort of a little bit of inventory. We have right now the problem story, the customer success story, and then we have creating a sense of urgency story. Any other stories you want to share under the sort of the closing the sale category before we move on to another category?
No, because then I'll have to tell you a bunch of examples and doesn't go there.
I think it also is important that all of us have different ideas on how to better manage and enhance our relationships with our business associates. And so managing relationships is probably a really important area where you could tell stories as well. And to improve in that area, could you maybe talk to that a bit and speak a little bit to, because I think that's probably an area we forget. How do we don't probably use stories in managing relationships. So tell us a little bit about why that's important and maybe an example of how it's implemented.
Yeah. So just to be clear, these are stories to help you manage relationships of existing customers, not somebody you're trying to sell to. So this is after you've made the sale. Now you have a new customer and you want to manage those relationships so they remain a steady, loyal customer. And the type of stories you want to tell here are typically stories. These are stories you tell your newest customers about your best customers so that your newest customers can become your best customers, right? You're basically teaching them how to use the products and services that they're buying from you in the best way so that they get the most value out of it and love their experience and want to come back. one of the examples of this I use in the book is from a company called Backroads, which is an active travel company. And I don't know if you've ever been on one of these types of vacations, but it's, you go off to some, great mountain resort or whatever, but instead of laying around in the spas all week, you're biking every day, you're hiking, you're mountain climbing. It's a very active. And these folks are basically your Sherpa guides for the week. They set everything up and they manage everything for you. And they take you, they ride the bikes with you and everything. And what they will often do, but by the second or third day of any of these vacations, the guides know their customers, by name very well, and they know their capabilities, and they always have 2 or 3 options. So every day, today we got a 15-mile bike ride, and we got a 25-mile bike ride, and we got a 50-mile bike ride. Now, like I said, by the third day, they know which person should take which route because they've seen them, they know their capabilities, but they don't want to tell them, well, Eric, you're kind of old and you're 30 pounds overweight, so you should probably take the 15-mile bike ride. They don't want to do that, right? So what they do is they tell at the morning at breakfast, they tell everybody about the 3 routes, and they say something like, last week we had a guest named Susan, and Susan was older than most of the rest of the folks and a little overweight. And so but she really wanted to go on that 50-mile bike ride. So what she did is she got up early, she skipped breakfast, she got out on the road before everybody else. We then met her at the top of the hill with some snacks or whatever, and so that she could coast down the last 25 miles and basically join up with everybody else. So she skipped breakfast and she only got a short lunch and left early, and it all kind of worked out. At the end, she was tired than most everybody else, but she felt really accomplished. So notice what they've done with that story. They haven't told Bob or Eric or Paul, you're not in good enough shape to go on that ride. But you probably know if you're not in good enough shape to go on that ride. And if you want to do it anyway, here's a way to do it without killing yourself, but letting them make that decision for themselves, because that's important that they choose the route and not be told by the guide, well, you have to go on this route and you have to go on this route. So stories like that help the customer make the best use of this vacation that they've already purchased and be happy about the end of it.
I love that. And you have to be so thoughtful and strategic, I suppose, in the types of stories, especially in a B2B environment, that you need to tell to drive that. And I love that mission of teaching your clients to be your best client. Mm-hmm. That's terrific. What about, coming back a little bit to the sales process? One of the things I spend a lot of time on in my day job is differentiating and how to focus on truly understanding what our differentiators are, and then how to convey that to the market. How do you tell stories to best amplify how your organization is different from competitors?
Yeah, that's a really important one for people to be able to do, because you're probably not the only one who does what you do, right? You probably have competitors, and you need to be able to articulate how you're better than them. The example I use here, well, the strategy in general is you're kind of telling 2 stories, not one, but it's kind of woven together into one story. You're telling a story about what it's like to do business with your competitor, and then what it's like to do business with you, so that your audience can see the difference between the 2. So it's kind of 2 stories rolled into one. So here's the example I give you is from a guy named Sherrod Madison. And Sherrod is the CEO of a company called United Building Maintenance. So it's a commercial cleaning company, right? So these are the folks who come in and clean your offices at night. So when he's got a sales call on a new prospect, he always goes in there with a sales manager and they go through a whole sales pitch, but he always finds an opportunity to tell a story about what he does when he gets a new customer and signs them on. He said, because it's always the same. There's a 30-day transition period between when I sign the contract and when we actually take over. And he says, during that 30 days, I always do the same thing. I sneak into the building in the middle of the night and watch how they're cleaning it now. Now, it's not as nefarious as I just made it sound, because he, of course, gets permission to do this. But the point is, at the end of the month, when he takes over, all those people doing the cleaning are typically contract employees. So he's going to inherit them at the end of the month. So they're going to become his employees. And he wants to know ahead of time if they're well equipped and properly trained, if they show up to work on time, if they're hard workers. He wants to know that before he starts. So he said, for example, last month, we took over the Verizon building in New Jersey. So, it's the middle of the night, it's 2 a.m. I'm in there, and I come across a guy who's vacuuming the carpets. And he said he's using the same kind of residential quality vacuum cleaner that I use at home. He said, what you got to understand is those corridors are 12 feet wide and a half a mile around. It's going to take that guy a month just to vacuum the carpets once. Plus, it's not going to do a very good job. And that machine is going to break down every few weeks because it's just not made for that kind of volume of usage. Now, when we took over, we put him into one of those, triple wide, industrial grade vacuuming machines. They'll do a much better job in a fraction of the time. Plus, that thing will last forever. So he said, then I went up to the next floor and I see a guy shampooing the carpets. And he said, it was kind of the same story. It's he's using a residential quality squeeze bottle, walk behind shampooer. And he said, same problem. It's not going to work well. It's going to take forever. So when we took over, we put him into one of those commercial grade riding shampooers, much better job, fraction of the time. Plus, notice this gets the guy off his feet. Now he's sitting down to work instead of standing all night. So we have fewer workman's compensation issues, which means my client has fewer workman's compensation issues. He said, but the last thing I wanted to see was how are they dusting the offices? So I went up one more floor and I looked on top of all the file cabinets and I saw the same thing on top of all of them. It's a half a moon swiped out on top. He said, I know exactly what that means. And you probably do too. He said, those cabinets are standard 5.5 feet tall, 3 feet deep. He said, the people cleaning them, it's not that they were too lazy. It's they just literally weren't tall enough to reach the back of the 5.5 foot tall, 3 foot deep file cabinet. And that's what leaves that half a moon swiped out on top. He said, the truth is they'd be better off not dusting it at all because it's the contrast between the dusty part and the clean part that makes it obvious to the eye that it's not been cleaned properly. He said, so when we took over, we just gave them all these little 18-inch extension wands for the dust cloth so they could reach the back. Problem solved. Right now, in a sales call, he could say, instead of telling that story, he could say something like, well, the 3 reasons we're better than our competitors is that we use triple wide industrial grade vacuuming machines. We use commercial grade riding shampooers, and all of our dusters have 18-inch extension wands for the dust cloths. And that's why we're better. And I guarantee you it says that in his brochure somewhere because those are 3 of his key differentiating characteristics. But once you've heard the story, it's much more compelling because it's a visual, visceral, reminder, or not reminder, but an illustration of the difference between not having those 3 key differentiating characteristics and having it. Because once you've heard the story, like you can see in your mind's eye that guy riding around on that shampooing machine, like the Zamboni driver at the ice skating rink, right? Like you can see it, you can feel it, you can smell it, you can taste it, right? It's memorable. And it illustrates how his company does their job better than their competitors, far better than just giving them the list of reasons why they're better.
That's a great story. I want to get into sort of how long stories should be, how they need to be put together, because my mind's racing on things that we should be doing better as far as storytelling. So I want to shift there. Before we do, I want to just take a quick digression. Usually at this point in the show, I give props to our sponsor. Now, we don't have a sponsor today per se because it's our 10-year anniversary episode, but I would say it's Shared Purpose Connect, the producer of the show. And I just wanted to let everyone know that we run, these weekly webinars and podcasts typically for payers and providers. And we do that because I used to, prior to building this show, I used to work way back when in the conference industry, and then I moved into industry, and I realized how hard it was and how ineffective it was to be able to go to a conference, stand on a conference exhibit floor, try to meet folks who are coming in to see our product or our solution. And really, a lot of the value of those conferences were anyone we could grab onto, have a drink with, sit down for dinner with, and just be consultative in our relationship building. And so I built this program to enable our clients to be able to have meaningful consultative relationships with their prospects, with the payers and providers they're trying to reach. Because I know how hard it is, especially in this economy, to be able to get out there and get payers and providers to sit down with you and spend any meaningful time with you. Everyone's calling on them, and there's no way you're getting through on the phone, and often getting caught in spam when it relates to email outreach. So we work with dozens of companies on applying thought leadership, producing content and distributing content, and then helping you network and identify leads. And what I would say, and I'm going to probably need help with this, Paul, one day as far as creating a better story around this, what makes us uniquely effective to partner with all these folks who sponsor our show is one, our format, right? Typically, if you've listened to our show before, we have roundtables of payers and providers and then our sponsors. So you're able to have a group discussion in front of a large audience as an equal, as a peer, talking about bright spots tied to a particular problem that we're focused on. So that allows you to not be overly commercial, but showcase your expertise, showcase your stories that you may have. And the last thing is, me and my team, as some of you know, I have a day job leading solution sales for a large healthcare company. And I have a lot of experience selling into payers and providers. And Tony Flynn, who some of you have met as our head of business development, has spent over 3 decades as a chief marketing officer and chief revenue officers at various companies. And then I have a team that comes from either marketing or conference roles in healthcare. So we become an extension of your marketing and sales team. And this is an unusual amount of commercial talent that you get sort of as a 1099 or as an outsourced type of extension of your team when you partner with us to sponsor our shows. And it allows us to work very closely with you and help you understand how to integrate your unique differentiators into our shows to be able to tell stories to the payer and provider audience that we attract. And that will obviously help you generate conversations. And we're fully attuned with your Salesforce pipeline and what your commercial quotas need to be and how that race every year is. And we want to make sure that you understand that we get it, because we do this also. And our programming can allow you a great platform to reach those goals. So if you want to get to know a little bit more about how we operate and you're not already working with us in a sponsorship capacity, and you want to meet with me and the team, I'm going to have Sherry put up a quick poll, and anyone that clicks yes will reach out to you and set up a time to meet via Zoom. So you could just shoot the breeze with us and get an idea of how to work with us. All right, Paul, let's get into this, because I could certainly need help, as you could tell, on story structure and how to think about creating my story. So tell us a little bit about, first, I'll let you run with it, like the structure, the timing. Let's take some notes and learn.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, these are, 2-minute stories. So they're not long. And in order to tell a story that short, you need to have a structure, a tight structure, or you're just going to ramble. So that's one of the reasons why a structure helps. The structure that works the best, I found, is there are 8 questions that your story needs to answer, and in a particular order. So here are those 8 questions. One is, why should I bother listening to your story? Right? That's the first question you got to answer. You got to give the audience a reason to want to listen to you for the next 2 minutes. Right? And once you've given them a reason, like to listen, like you've kind of assured them that the story is going to help them, not you, but it's going to help them, you've kind of earned the right to answer the next 5 questions. And here they are. Where and when did it take place? Who's the main character and what do they want? What was the problem or opportunity they ran into? What did they do about it? And how did it turn out in the end? Right. Now that should sound like the natural flow of a story, because of course it is the natural flow of a story. But if you're keeping track, there's 2 left. What did you learn from the story? And what do you think I should go do now that I've heard this story? I, the person you're talking to. All right. So the first question is to get their attention and get them to want to listen. The last 2 questions are to get them to learn the right lesson, to make sure they learn the right lesson, and to get them to go do what you want them to do. The 5 in the middle is actually the story that you're telling. But the 8 questions is the storytelling. It takes 8 questions, but the story itself is kind of sandwiched in the middle. And all of those things play an important role. The 5 parts of the story are kind of standard. The getting them to want to listen is important, because if they don't want to listen, they might not. The last 2 questions, though, are not questions you answer. They're questions you want the audience. So you answer questions 1 through 6. Ideally, your audience answers questions 7 or 8. You pause at the end of answering question 7, because you're technically done with the story. Pause and see how they respond, because usually people, after they hear a story, are going to tell you what they learned from it and what they're going to go do now. And if they're learned the right lesson and they're going to go do what you wanted them to do, perfect. It's better that it was their idea than your idea. If they didn't get it right, fine. You can always redirect them, right? You can always say, that's an interesting conclusion. I came to a different one, and here are my reasons why. But give the story a chance to work by pausing and listening. I mean, presumably you're having a conversation with someone, right? it's a requirement that you let them talk at some point. This is the moment after you've answered question 6, before you've even started talking about question 7, let them answer those questions. So I'll pause there if you have questions about the structure.
No, I don't. I'm looking. I have one. Yeah, no, I have a question in the Q&A module. Folks, remember your questions go in the Q&A module, but I think it's going to take us off topic. So I'm going to hold on that. Let's keep on rolling with this.
Okay. Well, that's structure. The 2 other things that I think you really need is, 1, you need to create the right level of emotional engagement. And the third thing is you need some kind of surprise in there. It doesn't have to be a surprise ending, but it's great if it goes there. Something unexpected in the story. And those are just 2 of the most compelling, engaging parts of storytelling, are the emotional moments and the surprising moments. If you don't have those things, I'm not even sure that you're telling a story, right? It's, you're talking to somebody, but are you telling them a story? And so there are techniques for each of those. The easiest techniques for emotional engagement is just dialogue, right? People say what they think and feel. It'll come out of their mouth. So your story should not just be a dry recitation of the chronology of events. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It should sound like, well, this happened, and then he said this, and then this happened, and she said that, right? And including the dialogue will naturally make it more emotionally engaging. But there's some other techniques as well. First of all, you can just tell people, he was angry, she was sad, they were frustrated. Just name the emotion. People will get it. My favorite technique, though, is I call show me. It's not you acting it out, but describe the physical manifestations of the emotions on the audience and let the audience figure out what the emotion must have been. For example, instead of saying she was sad, say she started crying. Well, people cry when they're sad, right? The audience will figure it out, right? Instead of saying he was angry, say he started yelling. Well, people yell when they're angry, right? I mean, the audience will figure it out. So, and somehow the audience figuring out the emotional context from the emotional state of the characters from the clues that you're giving them is a more powerful way for them to empathize with the characters, is that they have to figure it out. So that's just a more powerful technique. On the surprise technique, there's really one just great technique that I think everybody should use. And you can use it with almost any story. And I'll demonstrate it here right now. And then I'll explain how it worked. But so there's a 9-year-old boy named James. He's in the kitchen with his mom and his mom's sister. While mom and auntie are sitting at the kitchen table having a cup of tea, James is standing at the stove watching the tea kettle boil. And he's just fascinated with it, right? He's watching this jet of steam come out of that tea kettle. He's got a spoon. He holds it up there and watches as little drops of water condense on the spoon and trickle down and drip into a cup he's got sitting there so it doesn't make a mess in his mom's kitchen. He's just watching the cycle go over and over and over again, just fascinated with it. Well, eventually his mother kind of barks at him. She's frustrated. She's like, James, go outside, ride your bike, do your homework, read a book. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? You're literally staring at the tea kettle boil for an hour now. That's crazy. Well, fortunately, young James was undaunted by his mother's admonition, because 20 years later, at the age of 29, of course, and in the year 1765, James Watt reinvented the steam engine, ushering in the Industrial Revolution that we, of course, all benefit from today, and all based on that fascination with steam that he developed at the age of 9 in his mother's kitchen. Now, unless you're a history buff, I'm guessing that was a surprise ending to you, that turned out to be James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, right? To most of the people listening to this, unless they're a history buff, that was a surprise. Now,
or they've read your book.
Or they've read my book, yeah. Now, to me, though, it wasn't a surprise, because I read that in a book written about James Watt. It was a biography of James Watt. So it was no surprise to me at all that the story in chapter 1 about 9-year-old James was about that guy, right? Now, so here's the technique. I didn't tell you his last name, or the year. So what I did was I took 2 vital pieces of information that belonged at the beginning of the story, right? Question number 2 out of the 8 questions is, who's the main character? And, or that's question number 3. Question number 2 is, where and when did it take place? Right. So those 2 things should have been delivered to you at the beginning of the story. Now, it's not that I skipped those questions. I just partially answered them. I answered them enough to satisfy the audience, but I left something out so that I could surprise them with it at the end. So where and when did it take place? I told you where. Mom's kitchen. I didn't tell you when. I didn't tell you it was 1765. Who's the main character? I told you, James. I didn't tell you James Watt. All right. So I partially answered the question so that you would be satisfied as a storytelling listener and you'd let me continue the story, but not so much that I didn't have something that could surprise you at the end. And you can do it with almost any story.
I love that. So first of all, I can't recommend enough Sell with a Story as a book. A lot of the stories that you're hearing today with a lot of details that Paul's talking about today are in his book. And I know Sherry earlier on in the chat threw that on the chat. I highly recommend the book, whether you buy the hard copy or get the Audible version or both, or the Kindle version, or some combination of there within. I also, what we're going to do for anyone who wants it, this won't be necessarily the solution to everyone's story strategy problems, but Paul has provided me with a storytelling cheat sheet. It's a very dense one pager of a lot of the things that he has alluded to or talked today. It certainly doesn't replace the book, but it gives you a little bit of an overview of a lot of the things that were covered today. So if you want a copy of that, we will email that out to you after the show. So just click yes, Sherry will put up a poll in a moment, and we'll send that out to everyone in advance so you have it. We'll also, Sherry, what we should probably do too, because this is such a dense show with information, is maybe send the transcript to folks too. We'll probably send you, if you click yes, we'll also send you the transcript to today's episode so you could read through it and catch some of the things that you might have missed. This is so valuable. Paul, can we talk a little bit just about quickly what's a story and what's not? Because you just gave us the 8 questions. Just provide us a story where you maybe went a little bit off script with those questions to create the surprise. I'm always fascinated with sort of what's a story and what's not when I think I know one's a story. So maybe provide us a high level on that. And then I want to take one question from the audience, and then I want to ask you a blueprint question so that folks could have a really good storytelling strategy.
Yeah. The difference between stories and other things is stories have these 6 attributes. There's a time, a place, a main character. That main character has got a goal of some kind. There's probably someone or something getting in the way of that goal, a villain, if you will. And there are events that transpire along the way that hopefully resolve themselves at the end. So if the thing that you're talking about has those 6 attributes, it's probably a story. If it only has 2 or 3 of those attributes, it's probably not a story. You're probably more giving a speech or making a recommendation or making a presentation or writing a memo or whatever, and it's not really a story. But if you got those 6 things, it's a story, and the techniques that we've been talking about will work well on it.
There was I think in one of your blog posts or one of your content pieces, I don't think it was your book, in fact, you referenced an organization that put a storytelling test online, and you read through them. I'll put it in the chat. I took it. I thought I was going to ace it. I was surprised how subpar I did. But I'll post that in so you could really get an understanding of what truly makes up a story.
Yeah.
Do you want to speak to that at all? Or
yeah, that's an anecdote out of Australia. Yeah, they've got a great little website where you can take that test, and you do that a few times and you'll realize, oh, I've not really been telling stories. I don't know what I've been doing, but it's not storytelling.
Exactly. Let's just take a question. There was one question and we answered it. Did you?
Oh yeah, I did that on the fly, but
you are
talk about it if you want to.
All right. Well, let's let the whole group real quick. What's a story you could use with an upset customer?
Yeah. So first of all, don't think you always have to be doing storytelling. Only 10 to 15% of the time, I think you should be telling stories. So if you have an upset customer, you do what you know you should do. Listen to them, figure out what the problem is, what's bothering them so much, promise to fix it, and then go fix it. Right? That's the most important 3 things to do when you have an upset customer. And none of that involves storytelling. But if you want to use storytelling to help in that process, while you're doing number 2, promising to fix it, you want to give them some confidence that you're really going to fix it. Otherwise, they're going to remain upset until it gets fixed. The way you can give them confidence that you really will fix it is tell them a story about somebody else who had maybe a similar problem, or it doesn't even have to be a similar problem, had a problem that was upset about something, and your company fixed it pronto. And that will give, okay, so yeah, if problems come up, you guys apparently fix it really fast. Great. I expect this one to be fixed really fast too. So that is a way to use storytelling in that situation. But the main point is, don't think that you have to use storytelling, in every breath that you take. It really is only 10 to 15% of the time, that you're using storytelling.
Why don't we talk about, first of all, Sherry, I'd be interested if everyone who's listening live, how valuable they think just storytelling is as a skill set, and if they would invest in just taking master classes, let's say online, on storytelling to hone their organization, both their executive teams, their anyone, but certainly their executive teams and commercial leaders on better storytelling. So I was curious what people think about how important this is to what they do day to day. So let's throw that up there, Sherry, and get some feedback. Paul, why don't you end us with our blueprint for a storytelling strategy? Can you create one for us?
Yeah, so I think there are probably three things you got to do. First of all, is just recognizing that storytelling is something that's important for you and everybody on your team to learn. Right? If you don't really recognize that, then you're not going to be successful at it. Well, I guess part of that is, and recognize that it is something that can be learned. It's not just something that you're born with or you'll never be good at. If you recognize this is important and it can be learned, then you're off in the right direction. The second thing, and I can't say this without sounding self-serving, but go learn it, right? I mean, invest in it, read a book, take a class, watch some videos, hire a trainer. I mean, treat it like any other professional skill that you want to develop, and find somebody who knows what they're doing to teach you how to do it. The third one that I would say is, once you've done those two things, is create venues to capture stories, because you can't tell stories if you don't have any stories to tell. And I mean, that sounds obvious, but learning how to tell stories is only half the battle. The other half is finding the stories to tell. And you need to have lots of them, dozens and dozens of them, I think, in your repertoire. And there are really creative ways to collect stories like this. Like some of my more creative clients will have a story session every month. They'll invite, a dozen people, 24 people to lunch, 1 hour, they order pizza, and you're only allowed to do two things during the lunch: eat pizza and tell stories. And somebody's there recording everything. And so by the end of the lunch, you got, a few dozen stories. Some other of my clients will assign a responsibility every week at the staff meeting for one person to tell a story. And in advance when your week is. This week is my week, Eric, next week is your week, then it's Sherry. And when your week is, so you'll come with a great story to tell that week. Well, and it only takes 2 or 3 minutes to tell these stories and 2 or 3 minutes to talk about it. So that's 5 minutes out of your 1 hour staff meeting every week. At the end of the year, you got 52 great stories that everybody can tell. So putting in structural things like that to collect stories will build your story database.
Okay, I'm going to repeat what we just said there. We have 3 things to the blueprint. 1, recognize the importance of storytelling and that it could also be learned, sort of 1A, 1B. 2, invest in learning it. And I highly recommend the book. Oh, let me leadwiththestory.com is your website, Paul. Why don't we put leadwiththestory.com? Anyone that wants to check that out, it's full of resources to all of his books. I highly recommend Sell with a Story. I'm probably going to read another one of his books soon too, because it's just great. And so invest in learning it. And 3, create a venue or structure to capture stories. Those would be the pillars to a blueprint for storytelling.
That's it.
And Paul, folks could find you or reach out to you not only on LinkedIn, but Paul at leadwiththestory.com, correct?
That's right.
Okay, great. I just was super, super informative. I loved it. Love to have you back sometime and talk about more of the components of the story or another one of your books and some of the takeaways there. This was really helpful for me. One of my favorite interviews.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Again, I want to remind everyone that we produce Bright Spots in Healthcare for you to drive your production, your effectiveness in fixing healthcare. We're going to be sending out our feedback form for those of you attending live, so you can provide us with more guidance on how we can modify our programming throughout the year. And I always like reminding folks at the end that this is your Bright Spots in Healthcare podcast. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.